Today we come back once again on the problem of the relationship between the Roman Church and the evangelic pauperistic movements. I already dedicated 2 videos that you can find in my ecclesiastical history playlist if you're interested about the so-called mendicant orders. So I have been covering relatively extensively the answer that the Roman Church found eventually with these orders as well as others. We will briefly hint at that also in this video, but I think it's useful to repeat certain, obviously not the same things, but stressing, let's say better, a certain aspect of this process, of this relation between Rome and all these communities that had been arising in the from the 11th to the 12th and beginning of the 13th century in Europe, and that were moved by these instances that were that were quite dangerous because for the Church of Rome, because obviously they were anti-clerical, first of all, and secondly they were also quite heterodox from a theological and doctrinal point of view. And maybe, I don't know, I think I should have done this video before, excuse me, talking about the evangelic pauperistic, about mendicant orders, because this would have played better as an introduction. But I want to look in this video at at a broader picture of, and especially from the perspective of the papal of the popes, of how the problem was acknowledged and how the the solution was found, which is a bit of a generalistic video because as you understand it's a very big topic that would require a much deeper investigation. I don't know, maybe I will come back another day on this topic, but not in a while, because I can't talk about that as well. By the way, I'm no expert about ecclesiastical history, although I talk a lot about it because I generally feel that when discussing about medieval history, especially Western medieval history, there is sometimes there is very scarce attention towards ecclesiastical history, and I don't know why it's that. Maybe it's because modern mindset prefers to look at the lay environment and to maybe at the national or proto-national environments, and however the Church of Rome at this point was something that really influenced the whole Western civilization, and what happened there wasn't just the Pope saying something and then other people just listening to that. We will be talking now about a Pope like Innocent III, who was basically the most powerful pontiff that ever existed. At that time, the Roman Church had managed to even to make the emperors bow in front of her, and she had a huge power all over Western Europe, and not just the Western churches, but in fact the very Western political, the very Western rulers of those regions, and as we were saying, however, it was also a time of trouble. It was a time of trouble because there were so many heterodox movements spreading all over Europe. And this happened, by the way, in a moment in which the Roman Church was really changing her face at the time, and had just started to build that idea of her superiority all over the other churches, and taking the lead in the political direction of the Western Church at that time. And in front of these heretical movements, the immediate thing was, first of all, to understand whether they were heretical or not, because they were so spontaneous movements that it was very difficult to even to even really assess what kind of character they had and what kind of evolution they could take. In this sense, the Mendicant orders were the proof of the possibilities of channeling that force, that protest into towards an orthodox direction. So this tells us how really wide and differentiated and unstable, and I don't know how to say that, but manipulable and malleable these movements could turn when an authority like the papal one, often comforted also with by by other authorities such as kings and emperors or local clergy, could really transform. One example, aside from the Mendicant orders that came later, or were at least still in construction, let's say, was the Humiliated. The Humiliated were, if I'm not wrong, originary of northwestern Italy. There were some of these. They were similar to many other groups that existed at the time. And obviously, as you understand from the name, they had this aim of being humble, of respecting, the evangelical message regarding to, helping the poor, abandoning material goods, and obviously, being looked upon with suspicion from the clerical hierarchy, because obviously, many other groups like that one were preaching against the the property owning of the church and stuff like that, and it even took the violent path. There were bishops killed all over Europe at that time with these movements. That created problems all over, obviously also to the public security of kingdoms, of other minor entities, and we must say that they weren't at all purely religious movements. I mean, on the surface they were, and obviously in a medieval perspective, there was everything. Everything that happened, socially speaking, was always, aiming at seeking God's protection or God's approval in some way, and obviously there was a religious base to that. But if you really look well into these movements, and history allows us to do that, in spite of the obviously also the condemnation of the Church of Rome, stressed especially on the or often on more than it really was, the heretical, so the doctrinal problem at that point. And there were movements pushed also by other reasons. A pauperistic movement of that kind is something that in modern age you can find in modern, in the French Revolution, or in 20th century with, socialism in the Western world. I mean, there have always been group of very poor people who had essentially nothing to lose, and therefore took the violent direction in order to sack people who were wealthier than them, and claiming a sort of of moral superiority on the base of an alleged social justice that in this case was obviously comforted also by the religious beliefs. And the episode of the humiliated, you can Google that. I don't know. I'm no expert myself about it, but I still think it's very important and has to be recalled essentially for this reason, because it was a very important factor at that time, very relevant factor at that time, and it prepared the path. It opened the way to the mendicant orders in a way, because basically. The Church of Rome accepted this humiliated within the church, and this meant that the ecclesiastical hierarchies were basically accepting the instances of these religious movements, of this movement of protest, if we really want to extend the focus. The episode of the humiliated was a particular success, like that prepared to the broader success that the Church of Rome obtained eventually through the establishment of the mendicant orders, because the humiliated originally were however basically accepting, they had been accepted by the church, but they also had accepted themselves to enter into that path, because they had been they acknowledged the fact that by entering within the Church of Rome fully and without ambiguities, they were refusing the heterodoxy. And by continuing this pauperistic policy of theirs, and the incredible thing is that these people were very keen to those heretics that the church was fighting. So it was like saying for the church, let's use these guys to show people, and this is important in showing, and now I will explain why, that there are guys like those also within our ranks. Why is it important to show it? To show it visually, because obviously these poors made a lot of impression. There were a lot of poors at that time. It was normal in medieval society to have hordes of mendicants, of beggars, of people who lived essentially out of charity, of donations and stuff like that, and because it was normal in a medieval perspective, according to the Bible, to find those same characters that you couldn't find in fact in the Gospels, and that were normally parts of society. This has an explanation, obviously, that goes beyond the religious belief. We can say that medieval society was, that managed to absorb these people at large. There were problems also at this point, but it's only during the modern age that the phenomenon starts to assume a certain dimension that became to worry society. Also because economical dynamics were changing, so there were more poor people in proportion into those societies. But so it's not that people weren't used to see these poor, but obviously it was very propagandistically, how to say that, successful for the Church of Rome to show that those poors that normally at that time were shouting against the Church of Rome and criticizing her were actually in that case working for her in a way. So the same vision of this poverty that fought for the rights of the church in that sense was seen as an extremely powerful phenomenon that worked pretty well for these reasons. And we shouldn't however think that they were so obedient after all, because the humiliated still have some sort of anti-clerical prejudice. There was, and this would go on at a certain point in certain in certain branches of the mendicant order communities, the very intense debate over whether, I don't know, Christ owned goods, and about collective property and personal property and so on. So there was a lot of debate throughout the Middle Ages, and that's essentially what you see that eventually triggered, at least for social and economical reason, even before the religious ones, the the same Lutheran reform in the end. Also because the Church of Rome was asked to reform over and over again, and they basically refused all the time. So sometimes you might even think that it would be ordinary, that it was normal that at a certain point there would be some crack, like it happened in the 16th century. But even though things are a bit more complicated than that to tell it all. But the most important thing at that point was seeing, in spite of the internal debates and so on, and that was the most important thing for the church, that could contain that debate over property and ecclesiastical hierarchy and so on, that these movements would be orthodox, that they would preach in the same way those evangelic pauperistic movements were doing, but that at the same time that would work for the Church of Rome. So within a perfect orthodoxy at the service of collectivity, by the way, because these humiliated obviously were looked, there were people looking over them and helping them, but they were also doing socially useful activities, obviously. And they definitely comforted the religious aspirations of those who, aspiration doesn't exist, I think, in English, but it's the religious aims, the religious intentions of those who were already sensible to that model, to that pauperistic model, and wanted to imitate it. And the episode of the humiliated opens to the as we were saying, to the eventual evolution of the church in that sense, because by inserting these pauperistic evangelic movements within the Catholic Church, allowed pretty well to define in which side you were taking. Are we talking about heterodoxy or orthodoxy? Because that was really the point, because we shouldn't think really that these groups really even cared so much about theology or doctrinal issues. Most of them were just ignorant people who wanted something to eat, and they didn't care also because they didn't know anything about doctrine. And maybe, I don't know, some of them in their conscience would be very good Christians, and they wouldn't even understand at which point an heterodox thought would start and an orthodox one finished. And at the same time, we see that, however, obviously the problem of the political and juridical power of the papacy was not extinguished, and this process even brought to structure these movements that agreed on this specific topic between themselves, and this grew as a problem. So from one side, the problem of heresy was partially resolved. From the other side, these groups that would be progressively accepted by the Church as orthodox, and therefore, confirming their orthodox beliefs, and accepting the orthodoxy of Rome, because there were people who had contested, in fact, the same orthodoxy of Rome, brought to a great and important change, and the papacy felt threatened, obviously speaking, because you had contained heterodoxy, but now these guys would start criticizing the preeminence of the Pope and the clerical hierarchy. So at the peak of papal power over political and juridical affairs of Europe, so at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century, was one of the most important popes in all history, that is Innocent III. Probably the most important pope of the Low Middle Ages, indeed. Maybe just Boniface VIII can compare, but Innocent was really, you know, a milestone in papal history. And he instead started working pretty hard on this other issue. So in trying to stem as much as possible at the anti-clerical movements and fighting them actively to crush them. And at the same time, however, also keeping on that track of even automatically inserting all these new movements that were spontaneously forming all over Europe directly into the papal channel, the Roman channel, let's say, which obviously came by institutionalizing all these very diverse experiences that these groups were bringing in. And therefore we talk about something obvious, such as the birth of the Dominican orders. Think of the Franciscans, how quickly they were immediately inserted by the Pope, even before having their own written rule. They were created as an order. And the Franciscans were quite quite on that track. They were quite radical into that pauperistic character, and some of them, and even the Saint Francis, didn't have extremely orthodox thinking. And it's very interesting also to study this from a theological point of view. I wish I knew more, but just to tell you how diversified the various backgrounds of all these various communities were brought in a same cauldron, say, in order to be controlled by Rome, which eventually gave them an order, an asset, an organization that would eventually make them faithful, well-functioning, and even useful, as we will be seeing for the Roman Church, and extending her influence and power. And obviously in this there were certain models, because the Roman Church wasn't in the moment in which she accepted all these movements, she wasn't really letting them so much on their own. I mean, they could continue preaching in this Christ-like model of poverty, and etc. But they were, however, still channeled in some monastic and canonistic directions that already existed as such. The same Franciscans would be given, for instance, the Dominican organization, and they would become something extremely similar. Why the two orders have been born with very different characters. So there were a lot of adjustments also in the formal, at least in the form, and this in the formal organization of these movements, which eventually caused also some resistance from those sides. For instance, the Franciscans at a certain point quarreled within each other, because there was one branch that wanted to settle down to what the church had told them to do on the Dominican model, with some properties and structuring their own church in a certain way. Others were saying, no, we have to follow Francis' word. we have to remain poor, we have to continue going on. And this would create problems that weren't just merely ecclesiastical, but they had political and social and even economical relevance within the local communities, because also these people were growing. These evangelic pauperistic movement were quite attractive for many people, and were many people who would join them. And we're talking really about many people, numerically speaking. So these were all people who eventually were subtracted to other social roles, and started leaving sometimes of these offers. That was really one of the interesting things that we will be discussing in a while. And yet, as we were saying, however, we shouldn't stress also, especially in the case of the mendicant orders, that there were not innovations from this point of view. And these innovations, in fact, were coming back to the economical aspect of this. That is definitely quite interesting. Why did popes really allow this new form of monasticism? Because these were recognized as monastic orders, but up to that moment monastic orders had remained essentially inspired to the rule of Saint Benedict that had lasted for, at this point, 600 years, and by the way was containing also the experiences that came from the other monastic traditions that were at the origins in the ancient world of the early monasticism. So it was something very traditionally defined. So what is really the revolutionary, can say, aspect of these mendicant orders, and why was it allowed to be? Well, it was a very clever thing, because we defined the mendicant orders for for the mere fact that they were mendicant in actual fact. So they didn't need, the economical resources that they were taking were exclusively the ones that the believers were offering them. This was a really interesting point, because up to that point the monastic orders had been living either of private properties, essentially, which means that you have a monastery on some land which has other land. Monasteries were extremely rich, extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, extremely mundane, and part of the evangelistic pauperistic movement was pushed exactly also by this. I mean, by acknowledging the fact that there was obviously a convergence of these ecclesiastical wealth, both in the ecclesiastical hierarchy and in the monastic world. And instead, these guys were now getting money essentially only by anyone, by the population. Obviously, this doesn't mean that they didn't start immediately having properties on their own, because at a certain point it might seem strange, but I don't know, even the fact of where did this guy live? They had to live somewhere, and if you want to be a vagabond, it's fine, because that's also an evangelic model, but it's very difficult to organize an order and to define it as such without even having a shelter, a place where you can go rest and you can organize your mission, etc. So also here the problem within these same movements immediately started, and we can imagine that even before these their framing into the Catholic, into the Roman order, evangelic pauperistic movements were quite messy, originally speaking. There was always a lot of infight and quarrel relatively to such problems. What was the limit of property owning? That's a hell of a question, because this is something we relatively ask even ourselves today when we want to say, if property is entirely mine, I shouldn't be even asked to donate 1 cent to society. And other people say, no, private property should be abolished entirely and nobody should own anything. So these are two extremes, but reality always lay in the middle. We all pay taxes, so basically even our property right is partially infringed. And since there were quite extreme debates probably within the same Mendicant orders that we have recorded, because at that time that happened within the Roman Church, we can imagine how messy the situation was in the evangelic pauperistic movements all over Europe. That actually tells you also why they were so largely so even enigmatic for us to understand, historically speaking, because probably it was a very narrow, a very low level of agreement between these societies that, as we've seen, they're probably moved by much more trivial and material problems and aims than religious problems themselves. And let's not forget also the fact that other monastic orders didn't just live out of properties, but also of seigneurial rights, which means that certain bishops, for instance, well, we're talking about monks, but this happened for both really, that certain even monasteries would inherit as an exchange good certain seigneurial rights, because maybe, I don't know, a lord had dealt with this monastery and he wanted a piece of land, and in exchange he granted them the tolls over that river crossing, and that's how it had happened. So the whole thing was quite questionable, but at the same time it was how certain monastic or monasteries had made money and had their community going on. At this time, Mendicant orders are refusing this model. They're saying we get money just from the donations, broadly meant, possibly charity. But it's very difficult to define. You can give many things in charity. You can give a house as well as you can give simply money or simply food. So that really changes how you deal with them. With a house, with coins, or with food, you make a different usage of that, and you influence your relationship, your social relationship through those goods in many ways. So this was really an institutional novelty, as you understand, and it had a very important. It had a reason, telling the truth. It wasn't something born out of nothing, because from one side it's true, these movements had been asking for that. They had been asking theoretically to leave, thanks to donations and charity and stuff like that, in order to imitate the evangelic models and so on. But it was the Roman Church who was allowing them to do that. And why did the Roman Church allow that? Well, the Roman Church was quite clever, because from one side they were making these people happy. Because from one side, as we were saying, they were showing that the church was capable of having movements of that kind on her own. So partly they were posing the question of what did the other movements wanted against the church, since there were the same pauperistic movement working within her organization. From another hand, they were satisfying those same pauperistic movements, because they were allowing to leave like that, and plus granting obviously the Roman protection over them. But more importantly, and this is something I already discussed when I talked about the success of eventually of the mendicant orders, is that by allowing these movements to get money from different sources from the normal ones that usually the church had gained, and especially the local churches had gained, that we have seen were property managing and even seigneurial rights and every form of tradable, good that could be. At this point, these mendicant orders were so many and so big. We also said how large in number these communities were. Basically, it was making local communities, local population, to give money to them, therefore to subtract partially power to those political and economical organizations that really were, let's say, at the same level, or at least they were comparable to the, I don't know, to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. What does it mean? It means that when a new house of Dominicans or Franciscans was founded in a city, the local parishes or and hence the local bishop would start getting less money from the believers that were their own competence, because those people lived in their own parishes, in their own dioceses. Instead of giving money to the parish or to the bishop, they were giving them now to the mendicant orders. It was a huge struggle at this very time between the and obviously also to the monasteries that were often ruled by abbots that belonged to the high nobility or people of great social prestige, that were therefore local. There was local aristocracy from which the same bishops also were drawn. And what did this mean? It meant that these mendicant orders were used as a tool from the papacy to weaken the ecclesiastical hierarchies and to emerge as to go even more over them, because obviously these mendicant orders were quite cunning. Think, for instance, about the the communication. The idea that, I don't know, when you died, you would want to give your money to someone. Well, there were a lot of people in the cities who were incidentally quite sensible to the pauperistic movements, who started believing that those pauperistic movements mendicant orders were more worthy of their donation than the wealthy aristocratic bishops and do you understand? And monasteries and abbots. Do you understand what that means? It means that a huge quantity of money was drawn from bishops, monasteries, and therefore that the Pope could really could have much more influence over them by controlling the balance between these two different forms of organization, and extending its influence, by the way, in those same cities where the heresies had normally spread, because it was a largely city event, also a city phenomenon. This one of the pauperistic-evangelic movement. It wasn't something that happened in the countryside. It was the middle classes were so sensible to the idea of poverty, and for many reasons that I explained also in the other videos. So it was extremely clever, because this allowed the Pope to control heresy, to control local hierarchy, ecclesiastical, and as well as noble hierarchies, and to extend its power even more all over the Christianity. This was a very interesting tool. And plus, with these mendicant orders that really didn't have properties on their own, so we didn't really have first of all, they were extracted from very diverse social classes because mendicant orders rarely were made up of wealthy people. We have seen how, they were usually made out of poor people. So these were people who wouldn't, who hadn't the means and the possibilities and the capabilities to structure an aristocracy on its own, like abbots or bishops had managed to do quite extensively. And this made them even more depending on the local Christian communities through their donations, and obviously they also would be quite linked, quite tied to the papal authority. And this is why it was so clever, because it was a way to control society in a way the Church of Rome hadn't experienced before, and that really solved many problems. And believe me, there was a very, very harsh resistance by bishops, abbots, because sometimes I tell history as if, all of these guys were thinking just, that like everyone on earth was just thinking to do to achieve his own gain, which is it's a rule, let's say, not a law. And since it's not a law, you can see that actually figures like bishops were quite intelligent men, quite educated men who, yeah, they were immensely powerful and they had their own reasons and obviously they played, politically speaking, even militarily speaking, they had a huge influence. They were part of the nobility and so on. But sometimes you find these very harsh resistance letters to the Pope that were telling Rome, look, these mendicant orders that you have sent us, they're making a mess because they're ignorant. People believe to everything they do. They're taking, money away. Sometimes they're even putting the population, I can't say against us, but in a way that is increasing instability, and we can control well, because also we have there were indeed parochial duties that bishops and parishes had to perform. And there were people who were so much into these mendicant orders that for their donations and thinking about their salvation, that were quite quite forgetful of other duties. Also maybe because they belonged to factions that were adverse to the one from the family which that bishop came from. So maybe they had more reasons. And eventually, even if as we were saying at the beginning, even if these mendicant orders were born with with no property whatsoever and just donation, well, at a certain point they got so many donations, they had such a great success that they started building churches on their own. They started to become extremely wealthy on their own, extremely heavy within the political gaming, political balance. So you can imagine all the implications of this in a society that otherwise had remained quite similar. This is a problem that really starts to happen in Europe when the urban expansion began. Otherwise, in the early Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, the aristocratical outlook of society had basically rendered not necessary this. But at the same time, this was part of the very reason why the pauperistic-evangelic movement had been born, because throughout the previous centuries, the church has structured itself in a way that was highly elitistic, highly aristocratic, and on the surface didn't look at least anything like it was supposed to be according to certain reads of the gospel. And that's why those problems also started. Then, as we said, there were also social, political, economical problems in many ways. And this is the point I wanted to make for today. So I hope to have clarified, at least in part, some of these issues. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, I ask you kindly, if you liked it, to subscribe to my channel, or leave a like, or even better, to share the video. And if you have any question, of course, please feel free to write it in comment or even in the email, so that I can maybe even think of something new for my videos. I thank you again for listening. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.